Well, we are at the top of the hour, gentlemen. Would you like to begin?
Let's do it.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the virtual LTC series. For today's lineup, we are at Game 4, Presidents and Presidents-Elect. My name is Jenna Davis, and I am part of the Chapter Relations team here at HFMA. To kick off the conference today, we would like to thank our 2020 LTC sponsors, Parallon, Patient, Russell Investments, and Cenex. We're so glad to see so many of our dedicated volunteers here today to join us. Our goal for this virtual LTC conference is to share resources available as you embark on your leadership year for 2020-21. Today we have a special series for Presidents and Presidents-Elect only. 2019-20 Chapter Advancement Team Chair Dayton Benway and Chapter Advancement Team Member Andrew Hatemonic will lead things off for us this morning. You see their lovely faces on the screen. We'll be using the interactive tools with Mentee Meter to get crowd participation and review topics around running successful meetings, board meetings, and orientation. Next up at 11:15, presidents will be in one meeting and presidents-elect in another. Within those meetings, using breakout rooms during those sessions to brainstorm in smaller groups. At 1 o'clock, we'll all come back together for a conversation with Joe Pfeiffer, wrapping the day up with the last session at 2:30, where we will have a live Q&A. Your participation is requested today. There will be live Q&A during the conference, so please put your questions into the Q&A pod. We'll also be utilizing the chat pod to share information and tips during the sessions. Just a couple of quick tips. If you are viewing a webinar where the screen is being shared and the presenter's video is simultaneously running, you do have the ability to change the size of the shared screen and the presenter's video. In the space between the shared screen and the presenter's video, hover over the border of the shared screen. Your cursor will change to a double-sided arrow, allowing to enlarge or reduce the size of your shared screen. This will then also change the size of the presenter's screen. That was a lot of information, so thanks for keeping up. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the presenters for this session. 2019-20 Chapter Advancement Team Chair, Dayton Benway, and Chapter Advancement Team Co-Chair for 2020-21, Andrew Hatemonic. Dayton, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody. And welcome to the President-Elect session for today. Really excited to be with you guys. Unfortunately, I can't be with you live, but this is the next best thing. I want to thank Tracy, Jenna, and the entire chapter relations team for putting this all together. It's a phenomenal amount of work that it takes to coordinate all of this, and we're going to do our best to get through it here remotely. So welcome, everybody. And also, Andrew, welcome to you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Glad to have you with us. So Jenna gave you a brief rundown of what things are going to look like today. We are going to start out with this session. There'll be some interactive pieces coming right up. And then after that, we'll proceed. So what do you think it's going to look like, Andrew? Any?
That's right, Dayton. We hope to so we're gonna get through some of the fun things. I apologize, I'm having a little bit of technical issue, but there we go. So it looks like we're gonna get through quite a few fun things today. Like you said, we're gonna try and get to some interactive polls. We're gonna try and get a few things, doing things a little bit differently. We're gonna be using a tool called Mentee Meter to ask you a few questions throughout the morning, and I will tell you this is one of the things that I was just being told a few minutes ago, that some of these tools and technologies are way more interesting than the previous just presentations that we've been able to do. So we're really hoping to make this interactive and fun for everybody.
Yeah, part of those new tools we're going to use are breakout rooms within Zoom, and we're going to use those in the next session. So instead of being in these large kind of presentation style sessions, we're going to move to breakout rooms where you can have small group meetings, and it's going to be way more interactive, and that's going to be in the next session after this one, and we're really looking forward to that. I think that's going to be, it's going to bring as much of the in-person LTC feel to this as we possibly can, because we know that as much as you love hearing from us, what you really love about LTC is learning from each other and interacting with each other. And so these small breakout rooms are really going to be a great way to do that.
So let's walk through today's, we're going to call it batting order. Leading off will be Dayton and I right now, with lots of participation from you, the audience.
And then after that, at 11:15 Central, we'll be getting all of you and the CAT team members to, as facilitators. We're going to be going into our President and President-elect sessions.
So then we're going to take a 30-minute break to give everybody a chance to refresh, grab some peanuts and Cracker Jacks before settling back into your seats at 1, so that we can start the wave as Joe Pfeiffer steps up to the plate.
So let's make sure we all wave at Joe as he comes in. So after the 7th inning stretch, 2 to 2:30, you can look forward to coming back with some live Q&A with us. And this session is really intended to kind of wrap up the day and kind of bookend any of the questions, any of the lingering pieces that you want to talk about that we maybe didn't get a chance to early in the day. And we do a good job, I think, in live LTCs of bringing in the ability to pivot on the fly. It's a little bit harder in the virtual setting, so this is going to let us pivot and really get back to doing addressing those topics that are most important to you if we haven't hit them already.
Well, Dayton, that's quite a day, don't you think?
Sure is. And I think we ought to get started. No better time than now to get started. So first thing we're going to do is work on the Mentee Meter, as Andrew mentioned. So you can see that on your screen now. So grab your phone or tablet or use your computer to log into Mentee Meter, Mentee.com. Type in the code. You see at the top of the screen. Yep. So right up there.
2440.
Correct. So type that in, and then you'll be able to participate. And Erica's putting the code. So if you look at the chat, a lot of the things that we're saying are going to show up there as well, in case you missed it as we're talking about it. So as we get going, follow along on the screen. We're going to ask some questions. We're looking for you guys to respond once you get logged into Mentee.com using the code 702440. And this is our first one. So how are you guys feeling today? Are you ready for the weekend? Are you just like Dory, you want to just keep swimming? Or where do I even start?
I feel like I could check all of these boxes.
There's probably very little truth to the fact that where do I even start? This is actually one of Andrew's baby pictures. So it may or may not be true.
It probably isn't in this particular case, but I can almost assure you that there was some moment or hundreds of moments similar to this one in childhood. If at all demonstrated by my own children, who are 3, who have moments that who make me want to do that all over again. So
still even now, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, it looks like our kiddo on well, at least my left is ready for the weekend, and that's where most of you are. So that is great news. All right, next question. Which chapter are you from? Nevada in first, South Texas.
I think this is pretty interesting because what's cool about this is it gives everybody the opportunity to actually answer the question without a preset list of questions. So
absolutely.
For all of you who are thinking about what you're going to be doing with respect to virtual meetings while we answer this question and let everybody sign in, this seems like a pretty cool opportunity to engage people in a way that isn't just a webinar. I think that's one of the questions that we talked about last week, which was how do you get people to want to just join another online, virtual anything, and have it not just turn into a webinar where one person's talking? This is one of the ways you do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a great point, Andrew. So a lot of great chapters here. North Dakota taking up the middle.
Way to represent.
Nice job, guys. All right. So have you attended any of the other virtual LTC sessions? And if you're inclined, yep, see, there we go. I knew someone would be.
There's always that one.
There's always one. Yep.
I'm usually that person. I'm not going to lie.
Yep. So that's awesome that you guys are participating by and large with a lot more of your chapter leaders. I think that's great. I think it's going to make a big difference on kind of the collaboration that your team, especially virtually, that you can achieve with your team. So great that you guys have been jumping into other sessions already.
And thank you to the person who already texted me and claimed credit for being that one person. I appreciate you very much. And
yeah.
I'm not surprised one bit.
Yep. Very nice. So looks like we've got 61 total listed. That's awesome. So what we want to know about today is, which one of these do you want to talk about first and most, before we, we want to make sure we talk about the things that are most important to you. So do we want to chat about how to lead virtually, or board orientation and running an effective board meeting? What's more important to you? Looks like how to lead virtually is in first place right now. We'll give everybody a second. So how to lead virtually would also cover things like, how to run virtual board meetings and stuff like that. But how to do it in that, that virtual setting.
It is a bit different.
It is a bit different. This is definitely different. All right, so what else would you like to talk about today?
And I think it's important to think about this question too, not just answering it right now, but also thinking about the fact that at the end of the day, we are going to have a Q&A session where Dayton, myself, Chris Johnson, and Deanna Gray are all going to be able to answer some of those questions for you. And, obviously we've all been there before and done some of that. So we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to think through, what questions would I like to ask? We also have an opportunity to have a question and answer session in a little while with Joe Pfeiffer. And so be thinking, what are important questions I'd like to delve into today? These are some good questions.
Yep.
Driving partnership revenue. I mean, all these are good questions because they're, well, okay. I mean, the ending of Lost is a good question that you'd like to discuss, because I think we all have that question if we watch that show. I'm not sure we're going to cover it today, but I certainly appreciate it.
So I was not maybe as up to date on Lost as you are, Andrew. I think if, as we get to that question, I'll let you you tackle that one.
Well, I'll give you a little hint. Up to date's probably not the right word with Lost, given the fact that the show stopped airing, 12 years ago or something along those lines. But the ending was questionable for sure.
Now, if we were to talk about the ending of The Sopranos, that I could totally be more inclusive in my conversation about, but Lost probably not as much. So these are some great topics.
Yep.
Certainly a lot of these, you think about what we saw as challenges as chapter leaders 3, 4, well, we've been in some form of shutdown for what, 3 months now. So probably 5 months ago, if you were thinking about how your year would look and the challenges you had ahead of you, this list probably would have been very, very different. Seen a lot of virtual and remote words in these that we didn't even need to think about earlier this year.
Life's a little different.
So we've got one person who thinks The Sopranos ending was exactly as it needed to be. That's good. So we got some work to do on Lost, and Sopranos we're all set with. That is awesome.
So again, it appears as if the chapter relations team is just doing a really good job of providing us with kind of a broad spectrum of what some of these provides.
So we need better joke writers for Pete.
I'm sorry, I can't even stop there. I'm trying to decide whether that's actually Pete writing that question and just watching us, or if that was somebody other than Pete.
I know. See, it's with Pete, that's a 50-50 shot. I mean, it could be Pete.
He's not technically signed in as an attendee, so I'm just going to go with someone else giving Pete grief.
Well, Pete can take it. He's got big, broad shoulders.
Yes, he can.
So this has given us a great idea of some of the things you'd like to talk about. Certainly a lot of discussion around virtual things, engagement in virtual settings, collaboration in virtual settings, how to get sponsorships working best. Chapter success planning, we'll definitely get into that. Again, more virtual meeting. Membership and retention in this time, chaptering member engagement. Yeah, lots of great questions here. So we are going to capture all of this information because as much as we're trying to read all of these live as we go, we certainly won't be able to get to, pull it all together. So we're going to capture the information. We'll share it back. Each of us will be able to Andrew and I, and we'll be able to look at it and address it later. So next question, have you guys held a virtual board meeting yet? So certainly some experience with this.
Maybe we need to get a few of you on here to address some of these questions.
I know. Well, and so here's the great news about this, guys, right? So we're going to go into those breakout rooms later. There's certainly a ton of experience, or at least, attempts at running virtual board meetings. When we get into those breakout rooms, that'll be a chance for us to, share a little bit about that as well, and some of the experiences we've had. So, that's where that kind of sharing between leaders really is going to be I think a great opportunity to talk about things like this there. So 42 of you have, 11 not, so that's a pretty good. So the board selection and nomination process, when you think about the composition of a board, the board members are typically nominated by a nominating committee. And, I don't know how the nominating committees are set up for each chapter. I know in my experience, it's typically comprised of past presidents or past chapter leaders who have a good understanding, of what it takes to be a good board member, and they can understand all of the requirements and all the expectations. Voting typically happens through a written ballot, so in past years that may have happened through one of your annual meetings. It may have happened, at a special session you had. This year, certainly may need to think about a different way of attacking that, but it typically does happen. It can be virtual. I know in the past the chapter that I've been involved with has done it virtually for a voting process, so that can still happen going forward. But really, you need to make sure you're following your bylaws when you do this, and that you're adhering to those protocols and the process that are outlined for your chapter in your bylaws. And so I'd consult those as a starting point to make sure that you're following those obligations. So Andrew, what do you think about the orientation agenda?
I mean, I think it's a really good idea to put your board members, especially those new ones, in a position to understand really what they're doing. So, for example, individuals don't really do well in a circumstance or situation where they don't really know what to expect or what they're going to be asked to do. So it's a great idea to have this idea of either a full-blown board meeting where the initial, like when they first roll on, there's an orientation where everyone spends an extra 20 minutes kind of walking things through. If you include the other board members, it's actually a really good idea because it gives them a refresher of what the expectations are for them, because some of our board members aren't truly, totally, constantly active. In some of the smaller chapters where getting really good continued board members, it can be a struggle. And so it's always a good opportunity to refresh the expectations on some of those board members. So provide some kind of welcome, introduction, icebreaker, kind of like we'll be doing a little bit later in our small groups as we go into the 11:15 session. And then kind of walk through, whether this is a past president, the current president, someone just walking through the roles and duties of the board to say, this is what the real expectations are. Kind of giving them an understanding of the decision making that's going to be happening on a month, on a quarterly or however often basis the board's meeting, and then kind of giving them an understanding of what that fiduciary relationship looks like. So what are their expectations? What do they need to be providing? Conflict of interest policies, different things like that give them the understanding of how they're supposed to be managing and helping to manage the chapter. And then just an overall presentation of what those responsibilities of board members are. I think I've said this before, but one of the things that I'll point out is that in many cases, especially in the smaller chapters, where again, you may not have the highest level individuals, you're not always going to be CEOs and CFOs that are going to be on your board. This may be an entry level kind of board opportunity. So not everyone's going to have all of that knowledge and skill set. So it's probably a really good idea to lay out those responsibilities that the board member might have, and truly set the stage for them, hopefully to be successful not only on your board, but in the inevitable future when they get the opportunity to serve on other boards.
Yeah, I think the great points, Andrew. What do you think about within the orientations? And let's look at it specifically for this year, because I think when we look at the financial challenges that chapters are going to have this year with the change in revenue that may come from programming or sponsorships or what have you, how do you think that can fit into the orientation so that the board members understand what the flexibility with the budget needs to be and how the whole financial process works? And what do you think about that?
That's a really good question. And I'll be honest with you, I feel like that's actually imperative to include. And I know I didn't say it, but including a background or a baseline of the financial information. What is the chapter usually doing? What does it usually look like? Here's an example of where the financials were as of the last 2 year ends. But here's where we are today with COVID and meetings that aren't traditional, and the costs that we don't normally have. Now, for example, in some chapters, like Oklahoma, where I'm from, we actually typically see, and I'm going to use the word investment in, but really we usually lose a little bit of money on some of our meetings. So does that actually, I'm going to say benefit. Obviously, COVID does not benefit anyone, but how are we juggling the sponsorship revenue with the losses that we incurred against our normal meetings? and helping the board members understand what that typically looks like. Because from a typical perspective, our sponsorship revenue, our general sponsorship revenue, helps to support the chapter's overall operations, including those meetings. And so it's probably really important to provide new board members with a baseline understanding of what that looks like, but then also help them explain to them what the current situation we're living in looks like.
No, absolutely. And I think this year specifically, it may make some sense to do that board orientation for all your board members, not just the new ones. As you start talking about the financial piece, and maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but we're in a healthcare financial management association. Yet when you get on the board, you could be surprised by the different or the varying levels of knowledge of how a financial statement works, and how the financials of that chapter specifically may work. So it really could be a good idea to dig into those a little bit this year as you go through it, so everybody has that same baseline knowledge going into the year, so they can fully understand all the financial challenges and the flexibility that's going to be needed.
I think that's a great point.
Absolutely. So when we think about reviewing the duties and the fiduciary responsibility, certainly you need to exercise a certain amount of care, right? You're there as the guardian and the kind of the overseer of the chapter. And so that fiduciary responsibility means you've got to think about the duty of care. You've also got to keep the best interest of the chapter in mind while making decisions. Keeping in mind specifically, that may not be your preference all the time, but it might be the best thing for the chapter, even if it's not what you would personally do. You got to think about the whole. And certainly, that duty of obedience, your actions must be consistent with those of the chapter, the mission statement, the articles of incorporation, and the bylaws, right? And it really means being a good steward of the chapter, representing it well, keeping the lens of the member in mind and how they look at the board, and specifically the board members, to make sure that the chapter is represented in the best way that they can. And certainly there are times when you may have a board member now and then not live up to the duties of that fiduciary responsibility as well as you'd like. And that's a conversation that you need to have as a chapter leader and a president, that you really need to have with that board member to make sure they understand that the importance of following all of these responsibilities.
I think that's right. So what are some of the best practices that your board has put in place to ensure that all board members have a clear understanding of the chapter's financial condition? Again, go ahead and use your access to Mentee to give us some best practices. Dayton, while we're waiting, are there any best practices that you always thought of or utilized when trying to handle that or educate?
Yeah, we when I was a chapter leader, we made sure that financials were reviewed at every meeting. We also made sure that there was a budget for every program. And so the intent of that was so that not just the board, but let's say the program committee could then see, how their performance within programs impacted the larger chapter. And then, the board, if they weren't not involved in programming, could understand how each program truly did impact the big picture financial position of the chapter. So that was one of the things we did.
And I'll tell you, as a chapter leader, I feel like one of the opportunities I missed was to really enforce the idea of installing a budget like you talked about for each particular meeting. One of the things that as we were working with Lone Star on a joint meeting that we were doing, that their management organization, but probably also the chapter before we got involved, did really well was that they had a budget for every meeting. And most of the meeting management firms are probably pretty good at this, but they have a budget and they can continually show you where you are every time the meeting team gets together. That gives you an understanding of, are we in a loss position? How big of a loss position? Because you could go in knowing that you're going to lose or invest in the chapter a little bit of money. But that was really helpful. And I think it would also be really helpful for other chapters. If you're not doing that, certainly not, it's a very good practice to be making sure that you're doing something like that and then sharing that with your board members. Because like you said, you know, we have people as our chapter leaders who are finance folks, like perhaps you and I, CFOs, controllers, but there are also revenue cycle team leaders, patient access team leaders. And not to say that they don't have an understanding of financial matters, but it's a different understanding. Like they come from a different perspective, and they're not going to automatically, perhaps, in some cases, they're not going to automatically understand what the financial statement is saying just by glancing at it for the first time. So it is a good idea to continue to provide that education.
Yep, absolutely. And I think if you look at the answers that were just given out, again, those will be accumulated and we'll be able to share them. But the one that I saw most frequently pop up was sharing the financials, right? And making sure that there's transparency and visibility into the financial position of the chapter. And I can't stress enough how much I agree with that. It is the members chapter at the end, and sharing that, allowing for that visibility and that transparency is real important. So when we think about board meetings, from a scheduling perspective, Andrew, what have you seen work best?
So we typically have that 4 meetings a year in our in the Oklahoma chapter, and we try to attach them to meetings. So we have 3 in-person meetings a year, plus we have one that we kind of do that's a short one at the Oklahoma Hospital Association convention on an annual basis. And so we try to coincide our meetings with those. Now, obviously, over the last year or so, or the last 6 months, it's been different. Our meeting schedule has been askew, and we've been kind of trying to figure out how to virtually meet and how to make sure that we can get everybody present. But in general, we have historically tried to tie those to our in-person meetings. There is an agenda that we put together, including a consent agenda that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But it's really important that the thing for me is that if you have an expectation that people come prepared to talk about certain topics at the meeting, that they actually understand what they're going to be talking about. And so that doesn't just mean putting out an agenda, but also putting out a packet. So the financial statements are associated with that packet. The prior, and again, this goes to the consent agenda, but the prior meeting minutes are going to be included in that packet. If there's particular pieces of information associated with a big decision that the chapter needs to be including so that board members are prepared, then you should associate that with the packet that goes out to the board members. There can be a lot of different things that you include in there, but I certainly strongly recommend not only the agenda, but the financials, the prior board minutes, but then anything that's important. Just make sure that you're providing that information in advance. I, as a board member on a couple other organizations, hate it when you don't know what you're going to be talking about, and if they ask you to make a decision, well, you haven't educated yourself yet. Now, not every board member is going to prepare in advance, but the expectation, kind of one of the things that we should have mentioned a few minutes ago on a couple of slides about educating your board members, is the expectation is that you should come prepared. It doesn't mean you need to spend 4 hours looking at the information, but I can usually look at the information that's in the packet that Scott or the president-elect sends out to the Oklahoma chapter, because I participate in those meetings in 15 minutes and understand what's going on. So,
yeah, and, I think the other important piece to remember there is we talked about a fiduciary responsibility of a board member, right? Part of that fiduciary responsibility is being prepared, being educated on issues, and being able to talk to them when you get to the meeting. Mm-hmm. The board member can't fulfill that fiduciary responsibility if the packet isn't sent out with enough information and far enough ahead to allow the board member to review it. So, there is a partnership that goes there to make sure that happens. The consent agenda I think is something that certainly, when I was a chapter leader, we didn't use a consent agenda, and it's something that's taken a lot more prominence now. And I think it certainly has helped to move some of those topics that should be kind of moved through quickly to the top of the list, and you get through them quickly, and that gives you more meeting time to spend on other topics. And so they should be kind of grouped together, and you approve them all at once, as opposed to going through each individual agenda item, and it really does help to speed the meeting up. So I definitely use consent agenda wherever possible. Have you had experiences with those, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. So almost always do you include the past minutes. Sometimes you include the financial statements if there's not anything particular to discuss, but I actually recommend maybe you don't include that after just this brief conversation. It's probably pretty important to make sure that you are discussing the financial statements on a pretty regular basis. But yeah, I mean, some of those small items that are just not, they have the tendency to take up a lot of time, but these board meetings that we have, especially if they're only quarterly, like many of the chapters across the country are doing, you've only got an hour, maybe an hour and a half if you hold people a long time. And if you've got a lot of conversations to discuss that have meat to them, it's important to get straight to those conversations. So for example, right now, COVID, whether we're doing meetings, are we moving those meetings? Are we canceling those meetings? Are we doing them virtually? All of these are conversations that shouldn't take 2 seconds. They're real meaty conversations that have financial implications, that have member relations, implications, and so you have to spend the time where it's important.
So there is a question in the Q&A section. Thoughts on financials being included in the consent agenda? And I think you just touched on that, Andrew. And I've seen it done that way in some organizations. But I think given where we are right now, personally, I wouldn't include those in the consent agenda at this point. I would make it more of a discussion point for all the reasons we've already talked about. So.
I think it's a great question, because I'll admit that we have done that in my chapter in the past. But I do agree, the more and more I think about it, it's just so relevant for the board members to be aware of what's going on, not just now, but in general. And so continue to have that finance portion, even if it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes on your board agenda. I think it'd be really important to make sure that the board members know where the organization stands. So
now we're looking at responses around how to keep board meetings both productive and rewarding. And it was on an earlier slide, and we didn't hit on it specifically, but be on schedule, stay on time, respect the time of the entire board. I think that's a big piece of it. Agendas sent out ahead of time. I'm sure some of you guys have heard the saying, no agenda, no attenda. And I think making sure you get agendas out so that people know what to expect. They also know what's ahead of them on the agenda that way, right? They know what's coming next, and they can understand why moving through a certain topic at a certain speed is necessary so that you can get to everything else. Short. I love short board meetings.
Then you have to come prepared.
You do.
Have everyone prepared to discuss important topics. I agree with that. But one of the hinges is someone's going to ask a question because they haven't been informed or informed themselves on that particular topic. So these are all good.
What do you, one of the things that often comes up in board meetings is you may have, someone who just likes to hear themselves talk a lot. How do you minimize that to keep the meeting productive and efficient and moving forward? Have you ever dealt with that?
Well, one of the things that I like to do and I like to see done on agendas is have the name of the individual who's associated with particular points kind of called out to the side. So financial update, Andrew, program update, and then like have each meeting and like have that person, kind of like who's going to be doing that talking highlighted. It gives everyone an understanding of who's talking about something, but it also breaks down, you might even say 2 minutes, 5 minutes. I mean, maybe that's a little bit granular, but like assigning who's going to be talking and how long they have to discuss a particular topic gives ownership to that person and allows that person to really to know how much time they have to discuss that point. I feel like that not only prevents one person from doing the entire meetings talking, but it also gives a little bit more ownership to other participants, especially in those chapters where you only have a few leaders. There are many of those chapters, so it's important to be able to delegate those responsibilities, even if they're to new people and they're small things. Continue to put work to other people to build that pipeline, which is something we're going to be talking about later.
Yep, absolutely. So meeting minutes.
Yeah.
That's some important stuff, huh, Andrew? I mean, like, you got to keep a record, right, of the decisions and because when you're voting on something, there's going to be a record of the conversation and the decision that was reached. And this isn't necessary just so you can remember later. It's actually part of the legal record that goes along with the decisions that are made about the organization. So real important.
And there's a lot of good practices about it, but I think that the biggest thing is just make sure that you have someone there doing it. And I'm going to make a recommendation right now to all the presidents. If the secretary can't be there for some reason, don't own it yourself, because you are trying to run an effective meeting and you need someone who can take notes and minutes. Maybe it's a past secretary. Maybe it's just a past board member or someone who knows a lot about what's going on. But I've seen chairs of boards before who have said, I'm going to be taking the minutes for this meeting because so-and-so couldn't be here today. And my first thought was, well, how are you going to run an effective meeting and try and take note of every single thing that's going on? It's not going to be a great option. So,
well, but I think you just raised a great point there. You can't take minutes because to take good minutes, you have to be an active listener.
Right.
You can't run the meeting and be an active listener at the same time. It's just like those two things don't go together. You also have to be able to define like the action points, right? And these are some of the tips of taking minutes that we think might be important. So certainly when you're taking them, follow the meeting agenda. Because I think you don't want those minutes to be all helter-skelter all over the place. You've got to be able to look at the agenda and then see the minutes that are related, the conversation that was related to that topic. I think that's real important.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to address that came through the chat, one individual asked about why that was so important for minutes to be permanent. We are a legal organization, and so when you have a status or not-for-profit status, you're required to take minutes, maintain those minutes. Boards are required to make signers on, for example, their bank accounts, and the banks are going to ask you for a copy of the board minutes where the individuals are added to those signature cards or approved to be added to. So, these are all things that there's a lot of legal ramifications that require that minutes be maintained and kept so that you dot all your I's and cross all your T's from a not-for-profit perspective.
Yeah, so moving forward, I'm just going to jump in here real quick. Sorry, guys. We have an opportunity next week to launch all 64 chapters in the community for the board, for the chapter boards. And there will be a library similar to what the Leadership Connection library is, that they can post all of their board meeting minutes, agendas, and have that one place where everything is stored. And, easier than a box that sometimes gets transferred from, passing the torch. So I just wanted to mention that.
That's brilliant, by the way. I did not realize you were going to announce that. I hadn't heard that one yet. My head may be buried in the sand, but I think that's a great idea. Because if you've ever been the recipient of a box of minutes or the box of treasure things, and I don't know if the treasure aspect will be included, but it can be a big deal to be the one who's in charge of that information. So, I think
absolutely. It's always nice to have the voice from above, Tracy, jump into the middle and help us with some information we may not have known. So that's always nice too. That's a great initiative. I think that's fantastic that the association is helping the chapters in that way, because I know when I got the box when I became a president, it took me a while to get through it to start with, and then half the time I wasn't even sure what I was looking at because it wasn't organized in a real great way. So this is a great way to help with that. The last bullet on this slide is, I think, something that it's important to remember as well. These are business documents, so make sure that you portray the conversation using business language, and try to keep it short and sweet, but also descriptive, so that they don't need to be a real long, drawn out kind of record of every minute piece of the discussion. But it does need to be it needs to clearly represent the conversation that did happen, so that when you go back and look at it, you're not leaving a lot of uncertainty about how a decision was reached. So in using the right language certainly helps with that.
So what does your board do to avoid problems of paralysis by analysis, micromanagement, or detachment? I'm sure you've never experienced any of those things on any boards you've participated in, right, Dayton?
No paralysis of analysis has ever occurred. So I run the executive committee for my firm, and we actually call it circling the drain when we get into that. Because man, oh man, it can just go in. I'm telling you, it. So we one of the things we do is we fall back on what you mentioned earlier, Andrew, which is put in a time frame around conversations, right? And then it keeps everybody centered in the fact that you've got to get through this. You're just going to make a decision and go. Right. And as a chapter leader, as a chapter president, ultimately, that's your responsibility, is to make that decision and push the board and to get them to go, if they are overanalyzing things. At the same time, you don't want to micromanage them to the point where they don't have an impact, they don't have a voice, and they can't really, feel as though they've had the appropriate conversation that any specific issue may need.
Absolutely. I like squirt gun and electric shock. I don't know if you've been able to use that on your partners yet, Dayton, but those seem like effective mechanisms.
I think the electric shock one might come with some downside. The squirt gun, though.
Yeah, that's got to work great.
And air horn. Glitter bomb. Nice.
Well, as we wrap up this session, I'm being told from above we only have a couple minutes left. So would we like to share a couple tips really quickly for effective board meetings before we have to depart for the next session? I think I'll start with this first point. I think we've already covered it, but make preparedness mandatory. Set the expectation for your board members that they are going to be prepared, that they should be prepared, and that's one of the expectations on a quarterly or monthly or however often you meet basis. I think that, Dayton, the important thing we kind of mentioned a few minutes ago was make sure that you put the important discussions earlier so they don't get shoved to the end of the agenda and then have no time to discuss them. So that is a common frustration of mine, not necessarily with HFMA, but just at board meetings in general.
Yep. Well, and with any long board meeting, I mean, there does get to be a little bit of fatigue. So I think it's important to get those items first so that you can make sure that they don't get pushed to the end when the board members are already tired from the conversation and don't give it the right amount of thought. Right, I think that's important. So we've got time for this last question. The best advice you can give to a leader. So what is it, Andrew? What's your best advice?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was like a polling question. I was like...
No. I'm asking you a question, big guy.
The best advice that you can give to a leader. Develop thick skin is one. I don't know if it's the best advice.
Okay. I'm not going to judge you. I promise I won't judge you.
I don't know. There might be something that pops into my head later that's an even better answer. But like as a leader, you're going to have to make decisions sometimes that aren't necessarily popular. I mean, look at our state, civil, local, state, local, even national leaders who are all dealing with, for example, coronavirus. I know in Tulsa, our city leaders are getting beaten up by both sides of the political and social spectrums because they're making a pretty moderate approach to certain things, but there's never a perfect answer. So even when you do a good, you may be beaten up a little bit based on how that goes. So just develop thick skin and really seek guidance from those around you. There are a lot of leaders that have HFMA before. There's a lot of people who have senior experience within their organizations, even if they're not HFMA organizations. They can help you and provide guidance. So develop thick skin and seek counsel. Those are my two answers.
I would say mine would be to don't be afraid to make a mistake. Right? You're going to make a lot of decisions and you're going to be involved in a lot of conversations. You're not going to get them all perfect. I would tell you that HFMA, as I was coming up through the chapter leadership ranks, it gave me a great opportunity to try things and learn from those attempts. They weren't all perfect. So don't be afraid to make mistakes as you make decisions. Because at the end of this day, this is a volunteer organization, right? And this is an opportunity to try different things, not take yourself, overly serious, but to your point, to make good decisions and make hard decisions, because they're not all going to be the ones that people love. So,
absolutely.
So I think with that, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. And I think we're done with the slides themselves. So we hope you enjoyed the session. We have reached the end of it. Our next one begins, we're a little over here, but our next one begins at 15 minutes past the hour, whatever hour that happens to be where you are. Because the time that I'm going to show you isn't necessarily where you are. So it's 15 minutes past the hour, about 20 minutes from now. We hope to see you back in those.
As a reminder, you will use different Zoom links to access each of the next 3 sessions. So presidents and presidents-elect will each have separate links for this 11:15 session that we emailed to you, and I believe those went out yesterday. Dayton will see the president soon. Presidents-elect, I will be with you with Deanna, and we really look forward to seeing y'all in a few minutes. And then after that, you'll get to hear from Joe. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you, guys.